All right. Hey. Today's lecture is on community, politics, and regulation. It's supposed to be with Andrew and Tobias, but Andrew couldn't make it to this section, so I'm going to be filling in for him today. Just jumping right in. The thing that I'm going to talk about is Bitcoin community, and how does the community actually work. And so, to start off with that, I'm going to talk specifically about how rules are made in the Bitcoin community and why it's not as simple of a process as it could be. So I guess the big question is where does the community exist? Where we talk about throughout this course, we've been talking about people in the Bitcoin community have conversations, arguments, debates. Where do these debates actually happen? Because like I said, Bitcoin is supposed to be kind of anonymous. You don't really know who they are. So a lot of it actually ends up happening on Reddit, especially on r/Bitcoin. But there have been a few scandals regarding this, because that gives the moderators of this subreddit a lot of power, which there's a very famous scandal about this that I'll go into in a little bit. Other than that, there's also more open forums like bitcointalk.org, and there's some other ones. And also just people meet up in real life at Bitcoin meetups and kind of just talk and have conferences. There was a big conference last weekend that a bunch of people from the Bitcoin Association went to, and there's a lot of dialogue and conversation about new proposals and stuff like that. So basically in Bitcoin we have three kinds of consensi that we worry about. Consensus of history is what the blockchain kind of solved. That's the whole point, that everyone can agree that this is the history of every transaction that's been made. You have consensus on value, which is the belief that Bitcoins are valuable. This is pretty similar to how most fiat currencies work. And then so when you compare Bitcoin to other fiat currencies only really have the value, a consensus on value, and that's through government declaration. What they don't really have is the consensus on history, which is why blockchain is kind of a cool thing. And they don't have the same kind of requirements for consensus of rule, because the rules kind of just come straight from the government and the state. And in the Bitcoin, the whole point is to prevent that. So now what we're going to talk about today is, where does consensus on rules come from? So yeah, it's a really complicated and rough road. So yeah, buckle up. So just why consensus on rules is important, it's because for anything else in Bitcoin to work with, even to get the peer-to-peer system working, you have to agree on some sort of set of protocols, for example. That's how you get any system working. You everyone has to agree that this is the rules for this communication on this system. And so on top of the consensus rules, then you can build a peer-to-peer layer. Then you can build in APIs and RPCs, which are remote procedure calls, and then from there you can start building apps. But none of this would work without that basic consensus rules. So before we can really talk about how consensus rules are made, we have to talk about who's in this community of Bitcoin. So the three really main people that we need to consider are, first is miners, obviously. They're the ones who write history and decide which transactions are valid, and they have the voting power on new proposals, which I'll show you how voting actually works. Then you have the core developers, who are the ones who actually write to Bitcoin Core. Bitcoin Core is the main software that most Bitcoin applications are run on, and we kind of depend on them for Bitcoin's stability. And these guys are they kind of have a lot of power in the system. We call them core developers. It's just kind of a name. They're not really the only ones who can develop for it, but they are sort of the lead developers and do kind of have some level of final say in whether on pushes to the main code base. And a lot of these people, these original core developers, are really big in the Bitcoin community today. Finally, you have companies that create applications for Bitcoins, and just because of the size of these companies, and they do have a significant amount of say in like what kind of decisions get made in the ecosystem. And finally, there's the users, people who aren't mining but just doing daily transactions. They don't have that much say, honestly, in like new changes to the Bitcoin system. And there's a lot of people who propose that like want new ways such that the average user can get more say into this to make it more decentralized. You have regulators, which is what Tobias's entire presentation will be about, is people who aren't really in the Bitcoin system, like the government, wanting to like control the Bitcoin system. And then you have journalists who just kind of like can influence through like media and public and change public opinion.
Is the main repo for Bitcoin on GitHub or somewhere else? Or because that's centralized?
Yeah. Max, you know where that is? The main repo for Bitcoin?
Oh, Bitcoin/Bitcoin.
It's on GitHub?
Yeah, it's on GitHub.
Yeah, this is just an old diagram looking at some of the companies and various divisions. Most of these companies are dead or their founders are in jail. So I'm going to start off with some internal politics. So one of the biggest things that you have to understand in Bitcoin is that the merchants and miners are kind of constantly pitted against each other because merchants want lower transaction fees while miners want as high transaction fees as possible because that's how they profit. And so this causes a lot of like conflict within the system. For example, miners always have the power pretty much because miners can just choose to like mine on a new blockchain. They can kind of like as we showed in the game theory talk, like they can kind of like hold the system hostage and kind of get more transaction fees for themselves. And this also leads to an issue of decentralization versus scalability. And we'll look at this in the Blocksize debate. And once again, the Bitcoin community tends to be very like technical and libertarian, like getting a lot of people to come together who are really like anti like centralization is very difficult. So this is what I was talking about before. Bitcoin Core is the like de facto rulebook of Bitcoin. It's the most widely used Bitcoin software. It's not the only one, but it basically is an open source software that serves as the central point of discussion about Bitcoin's rules. And basically anyone can go ahead and do a pull request on this and like can contribute like any sort of improvement they want. And then what this does is you can create a Bitcoin improvement protocol, which is basically a way to say, oh, I've written the code for this kind of change and I want it to be implemented. And then you kind of put it to the network to like vote, should we implement this chain or not? And then often the court, you don't have to write the code yourself. You can kind of also suggest a Bitcoin improvement protocol Bitcoin improvement proposal. And then the core developers, if it gets enough traction, will start developing it for you. So how a Bitcoin improvement proposal works is that basically a developer will publish his proposal and then miners vote on it. And so how do you get people to vote on it? It's kind of a very interesting way of doing it. So because like you don't know who miners actually are, because like identities are completely anonymous in this system, the way that you get people to vote is in the Coinbase transaction, where you can put like a little bit of text in your code. Basically, the core developers will say, okay, these next 100 blocks are going to be designed like in your Coinbase transaction. You want to vote. You want to put your vote as to like, do you want to pass this proposal or not? And the idea is that if you control approximately like 1% of the network hash rate over the course of 100 blocks, you're going to approximately get one block that you win, which means you're going to get to put in one vote. And so, like I said, this gives like obviously it's usually not done with 100 because that's way too small, and it's usually done with much higher number of blocks, usually around 1,000. But it's just a way. It's a really interesting way of like getting people to vote, because in this system, like not everybody gets to vote. In reality, only 100 people vote. But given the fact that like mining pools control most of it anyways, it kind of ends up being a roughly good distribution of how the system would have voted. And the problem with this is it does potentially benefit miners over the whole ecosystem because now mining pools can like control what kind of proposals go through, and they can like basically just reject any proposal that like hurts them. Yeah. So Bitcoin Core tends to be extremely conservative when it comes to like changes. The Bitcoin like core team is like very against the idea of hard forks, which we discussed earlier in the class. But there's some like debate as to like whether this is a good philosophy to hold, because like there's some people who say like yes, you shouldn't be hard forking because you're supposed to like keep things as immutable as possible. But then at the same time, like that's the only way for the currency to like adapt to new changes, and like a lot of like for example Zcash, which is another big altcoin, they've kind of accepted that they have to do hard forks in order to like constantly update their software. So yeah, what the Bitcoin Core community does is instead of doing hard forks, they focus on incremental solutions. So they kind of often put together some very hacky solutions in order to avoid doing a hard fork. And one of these examples is Segregated Witness, which I'll go into. And the real reason that they're so conservative with all this is because at this point, Bitcoin is like has like hundreds of millions of dollars worth of like actual wealth stored in Bitcoin, and you don't want to accidentally do something that like messes up everything. So that's why they're very conservative with what kind of changes they make. And this is what leads to a lot of altcoins. So a lot of altcoins are designed as ways to like test new features that would never get approved into Bitcoin Core. So they said, okay, what they do is they take the Bitcoin Core software and kind of just like the repository and just fork the repository. And from that code base, they start like adapting it. And the reason that they do this is instead of starting from scratch is that the Bitcoin Core like code base is really stable. It's had like 6 years of like just trial against it to make sure it's extremely stable. Yeah. So the block size debate. What happened was in 2015, Bitcoin blocks started to fill up. There started to be more transactions that could fit in the 1 megabyte block size at the time. And so what this means is that like blocks are at a risk of longer, like they couldn't handle the transaction volume. And so there was a lot of disagreement over the solution, and there still is today. And so one of the main points of contention as to like the debate was decentralization versus centralization. So Bitcoin Core, being conservative, wants to maintain the decentralization of the Bitcoin blockchain base layer. And they want to use software patches such as Segregated Witness and like additional protocol layers that will go on top of like Bitcoin Core and won't actually change Bitcoin Cores. And like Lightning Network is an example of like a supplementary software that doesn't actually need to change the main Bitcoin Core layer. So one of the big examples of like an alternative idea is Bitcoin XT. Gavin Anderson and Mike Curran, they were like two of the core developers who were like on that like first slide I showed with like the 5 main core developers, and they were like huge supporters of this. And this basically wanted to increase the block size to 8 MB, and they thought that okay, this will like make sure it'll last for like a good amount of time. We can, if it somehow gets to like the point that we're filling up 8 MB blocks, that's a problem for later, but that means we've like actually hit scale at this point. So Bitcoin Core, they wanted to maintain the current limit and explore other ways of addressing the issue. And so this caused a lot of debate. And one interesting like controversy about this goes back to like why Reddit, the moderators of the subreddit have a little bit too much power. A lot of the moderators were really like against Bitcoin XT, and they kind of just like completely censored like talk about Bitcoin XT on the subreddit, and their like justification for it was they're like, oh, Bitcoin XT is going to be a fork of Bitcoin, therefore it's not Bitcoin, therefore we have the right to like censor it. So this is like, and this caused a lot of like anger in a lot of the community who were really supportive of Bitcoin XT. And another big issue with like why a lot of people are against the increase in block size, other than the fact that it would require a hard fork, is that as block size increases, so does miner concentration. So that's kind of an issue. Yeah, that's a picture of Gavin Andreessen destroying the block size. So yeah, Bitcoin Classic is another like alternative one that instead of XT, unlike XT, it raises it only to 2 MB, and it's a much simpler implementation than XT. It's like less chance for error, so that's why a lot of people have kind of admitted that like XT is failed. It's not gonna work now, like because it's just not getting enough traction. So a lot of those people who are on that bandwagon have kind of switched over to Bitcoin Classic, saying it will be easier to make the shift than to XT. And yeah, so Roger Ver, he was like a very prominent Bitcoin advocate, often called Bitcoin Jesus. And he was a staunch proponent of increasing the block size. And his reasoning was that the original goal of Bitcoin was to become a true currency, and the current block size is like economically unviable. And so he supports like almost all increases to the block size. And so those are some of the like Bitcoin XT and Classic, or some of the ways that like you can use hard fork. So what Bitcoin Core has been supporting recently is something called Segregated Witness, where what it does is it right now in the Bitcoin like trend on the blockchain, all the signatures are being stored on the blockchain, and that takes up almost like 50% of the space on like in the 1 MB. And so there's this new proposal called Segregated Witness, which is like almost done like through development, and it basically takes the signature out of the transaction, and this like provides more room in the block. And since it takes up 50%, you can now put like double the transactions in one block, which essentially it's like a very hacky solution at accomplishing the same thing that Bitcoin Classic would accomplish by doubling the block size. Yeah, so it attracted a lot of mainstream enthusiasm in the Bitcoin community. It's pretty much gonna go through. What they need is they need a 95% of, like they need 95% of voters of miners to agree to it, and it was gonna go through until about last week, when what happened was there's another proposal called Bitcoin Unlimited, which is a very decentralized way to control the blockchain, where it basically allows all miners to choose their own block size. And what will happen is you could say that if I wanted to set my own personal block size to be 2 MB, but I get a block size that's like 4 MB, like I wouldn't build any blocks that are 4 megabytes large. But if the longest chain happens to have one at 4 megabytes, and like it's already like 4 blocks in or something, I would just say like, oh, okay, screw it at this point. I'm just gonna start working on that chain, even though it has a 4 MB block, which is like kind of against what I'm supposed to do. But I'm still gonna do it anyways, just to keep the system viable. And this like really like decentralizes everything, because it creates this like there's a whole paper on why like the market will get to decide what the block size is, and this kind of like a lot of people are supporting this because they say that like, oh, the block size is like the only centralized part of all of Bitcoin, and if we can like decentralize that, it will be like just lead to more decentralization, which is like what people want. And so what happened was you need 95% of the hashing power to vote for a segregated witness. But last week, via BTC, which is a Chinese mining pool, which has about 10% of the hash power, they said we are not supporting segregated witness anymore because we want to support Bitcoin Unlimited. And because of this, segregated witness no longer has the 95% it needs to like actually be implemented. So there's a lot of debate going on about it right now. So yeah, this is like kind of the whole like idea. The blockchain debate is just like one way of like showing like how there's a lot of issues and getting a lot of libertarians to come together on an agreement. Another thing that like I haven't got a chance to write down in the slides because it's like super new, just in like the last 3 or 4 days, is so remember how we talked about like how Ethereum had a fork because there's like some people who wanted to on the hack that was on the DAO, some people wanted to let the hacker keep the money, and other people reverted the blockchain to a point where the hacker did not get the money. So now you have like Ethereum Classic and like Ethereum, like the normal Ethereum, which is the one where the miner didn't get the money. in the normal Ethereum, they're doing another hard fork, which is basically implementing a bunch of security features to make sure this kind of hack doesn't happen again. And pretty much everyone on the normal Ethereum chain is like pretty much okay with this hard fork, so they're going to switch over. But now in the original chain where the hacker kept his money, there's some people who want to implement this security changes so that way this hack doesn't happen again, obviously. And then there's some people who are like, oh, no hard forks. And so now like the Ethereum Classic is starting to fork, is probably going to fork as well. It's going to be like Ethereum Classic or something. Yeah. So that's just like an example of like, that. This is like, all of this stuff I'm talking about, like community problems, are like extremely recent. Like this stuff is literally happening. Like I'm checking Reddit like every day just to see like what the latest updates on this stuff is. So yeah. Now Tobias is going to talk about like regulation and law.
The boring stuff. Please, before I begin, if you have questions, ask them directly and read with me on the slides, because we're talking about regulation and law there. So there's a lot of text in the slides, and there's a lot of nitty-gritty little rules. So if you have questions, ask them, please. Space or?
You have to like click the little button.
Oh, next. Yeah. So there's a lot of discussion about regulations, and there's a lot of questions about regulations. Is it even regulated? Is it safe? How is it regulated? Do we need to regulate the blockchain? Do we need to regulate cryptocurrencies? Is it possible to regulate it? And that's also one of the things that we're going to discuss. And as explained, there's a lot of discussion in the community if the government is even need to be involved in cryptocurrencies or blockchains. So, what does regulation mean? You can either, in a directive made and maintained by an authority, so like the government, or you can regulate a process process of regulating or being regulated. So it's regulating a certain process within a company or a certain process within the government. And as we all know, the blockchain is a sort of a process, so you can think that you can regulate the blockchain. But what are the issues regarding regulation? We have a new currency, and currencies at the moment are regulated. Dollars are regulated, euros are regulated, but cryptos are not regulated. It's a new way of raising capital. For raising capital, you need to be regulated. You have new business models, they need to be regulated. So imagine how many things you can regulate within the cryptocurrency world, and the community doesn't want to be regulated because it's like an open community. Especially for moving funds around, you need to have a money transmitting license because you're going to transmit money. We're going to dive in it a little bit deeper later on. And maybe one of the things that within companies can be regulated is smart contracts. So as you can see, there's a lot of things within the crypto world and within the blockchain world that can be regulated. So if we look at the regulatory institutions, we have the federal ones and the state ones, because every single state has its own regulation on virtual currencies. So we have the FinCEN and AML, and they come up with the money transmitter regimes. So talk about a little bit more about it later. And we have the BIT license. It's a license if you want to use virtual currency. The IRS and the SEC. So the SEC is also busy with making knowing where they need to regulate the Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies. And I forgot to say one thing here. So if you think about regulating cryptocurrencies, what you mostly see nowadays is that they regulate the endpoint. So when the Bitcoin touches the ground, sort of, so where they get to like a change, and at that moment the regulation comes in, and then the government comes in to check in with the money and what's happening with the money and where did it came from. This is not interesting. So currently, Coinbase is regulated in 25 states plus Puerto Rico, and every single state has its own state laws on virtual currencies. And for example, in Miami State, there already have been a couple of arrests. So we'll tell more about that, about exchanging virtual currencies, because they have a different law than in New York and California. And California recently repealed a provision of state law that prohibited the use of anything but lawful money of the U.S., legalizing the U.S. and Bitcoin in the state. So it's legalized in in California. And some states have determined that the transactions solely involved in virtual currencies do not constitute to money transmission. So it has nothing to do with transmitting money. So the Commodity or Futures Trading Commission, they have given the Bitcoin a virtual currency as a commodity. So they treat it as a commodity. So it's different than a currency or different than a stock or than a security. So they come up with a real virtual currency in the term was defined as a digital representation of the value that the function as a medium of exchange and a unit of account and or store a value but does not have a legal tender to status in jurisdiction. So it does not have any legal standing within jurisdiction. Okay, SEC. We all know the SEC from the stock exchanges. They secure stocks as a security, but Bitcoin is not a security. So that's an issue what the SEC is now figuring out, because the Bitcoin is not seen as a security, so how can you regulate it? But then we have the Winklevoss brothers. They're trying to get the Bitcoin on the stock exchange, and then you get a security. So then a virtual currency is a security. So, and they're not yet they did not yet get the license for it, but they expect at the end of this year that they probably get the license, and then you have a ETF, a Bitcoin ETF, which you can trade on the stock exchange. And SEC already did some actions on Ponzi schemes, because people started Ponzi schemes, and Ponzi schemes are seen as a security within the SEC regulation. So there have been quite a lot of arrests within those Ponzi schemes. And people like Eric Voorhees, one of the people who got has been charged for using Bitcoin in the wrong way. So how do they do it in Europe? In Europe, we're quite far behind. Quite far before than the United States, because the United States is behind of any other regulations. And they defined it as electronic money, so they made it even broader. Instead of just giving Bitcoin a name, they just gave the whole system a name. So they defined it as a virtual currency and an electronic money. So they're now building a complete regulatory system within the European Union, and especially in England. In UK, they're very good at making this progress within Bitcoin and virtual currencies. And what the World Federation of Exchanges did, and they saw that the Bitcoin was coming up, so they sent out a large survey in June 2016 to all the partners, and this to ask them how are they getting involved in Bitcoin. And the outcome of this survey was that every single bank in the world or the partners is getting involved in Bitcoin. So they're now coming up with a worldwide regulation on how they're gonna regulate the exchanges between those banks, and they still don't know how they're gonna do it. So it's quite preliminary. What can governments do to make it work? This is quite interesting. So you can see it as a virtual sovereign. So the virtual currency providers will serve as a regulatory by enforcing the terms of their contracts with the users to prevent cyber fraud. But what you also can do is just prohibit everything. So you can prohibit the whole complete Bitcoin. There are a couple of countries who completely prohibited the Bitcoin, and you cannot use the Bitcoin anymore over there. You can do selective prohibition, maybe for 1 or 2 states. You cannot use you cannot use the Bitcoin. That's also an option. You can do selective regulation. So regulators impose some restriction to specific aspects of the virtual currency, such as taxation and regulation in intermediate. So you take only one part of for maybe your profit on making trading with Bitcoins. It's only that is regulated. And the last one is the most interesting one, I think, for the community, because it's they think about the community and how they can regulate it themselves. So the real-world assisted virtual currency, the self-governance. So governments will provide support for mechanisms whereby users, virtual currencies can agree upon and enforce their own community standards. So basically also how the Bitcoin is being managed by their own community, so they can come up with their own regulatory system in order to regulate their system. So how the UK treats income from Bitcoin. So basically what these 4 lines say is that the UK doesn't ask tax for Bitcoin. So if you make any profits on Bitcoin, they do not tax it. So it's sort of a free money haven. If you have a Bitcoin company over there and you make a lot of profits over there, you don't need to tax it. So why do we do it? Maybe because they're the front runner on within the virtual currency world. A lot of these companies who trade in Bitcoin are also in London, and there are also a lot of startups over there. So maybe they did it to be like the hub for virtual currencies. So then we have law. This is getting even more boring maybe, but I'm not going to dive into the different licenses. So the Financial Crime Enforcement Network came up with anti-money laundering, and companies as Bitstamp and Coinbase are under the compliance of anti-money laundering. So what do? They gather all the data from the transactions and from how people behave within the transactions, where do the transactions go, and analyze this in order to research if there is somebody doing money laundering within the system. And this is one of the licensings that you can get. And there are now 25 companies in the waiting to get this license. Know your customer. This is also from the FinCEN. It's important to know who is your customer. And this is also a quite interesting thing, because if you trade on Coinbase, you don't need to show any personal data. But when you want to transfer it from your Bitcoin to your dollars, you need to show your passport, you need to show where you live, you need to show everything. So your whole anonymity is gone. And that's because of the Know Your Customer regulation. So they need to show the government who's their customer, who's trading their money. So if you want to trade it into dollars, you need to have this license. Money transmitter license. It's an entity that provides money transfer services agreement or payment instruments. So if you're a company like that, you need to have a money transmitter license because you're transmitting money between parties. And if you don't have this license and you're gonna transmit money between parties and you don't have this license, you will be charged with a large fine. And Ripple got this fine and they got a $700,000 fine because they started transmitting money before they even got the license. So that's what you see. They will just give you a penalty for doing this. And in order to get this money transmitter license, you need to be audited by financial statements of the applicant business and subsidiaries. And there's a lot of rules where which you need to follow before you can get this license. And then we have the New York Bit license. The New York Bit license is a license which you can get if you do one of these 5 things. So if you receive virtual currency for transmission or transmitting it, holding virtual currency for others, buying and selling virtual currencies as a customer business, etc. If you're doing these things, then you need a New York Bit license, and they will give you the license to do these 5 activities. And this is a collaboration between the New York Finance Department and the SEC in order to make a license and to regulate also sort of money transmitting and these activities within Bitcoin community. A really interesting thing is that, as you can see, this is about money laundering. So what's the risk of money laundering, and how high is the risk that maybe digital currencies are riskful for doing money laundering? As you can see, the banks, accountancy service providers, legal service providers are all very high on money laundering. So you can see they probably process a lot of money laundering orders instead of digital currencies where it's very low. But how can this be possible? Because digital currency is not a method by which terrorists raise money or or move money out of the UK. The UK government did a research on this, and they didn't see any signs that people were using digital currencies for terrorism or for buying other things. But of course, on Silk Road for drugs. But what maybe is a problem with this research is because it is the size of the comparative cases, because the banks are really big. They handle multiple billions, and maybe there's a money laundering issue where maybe the 70 million is being penalized because it was money laundering. And within the Bitcoin community, we don't have that amount of capacity to either do such a big money laundering. So maybe in the future the index will change, but for now it has a lower risk. In the United States, in-person exchange or local bitcoins is highly illegal. So if I want to trade bitcoins with maybe somebody here in the room, and we just do it right here, and I give you the bitcoins, it's highly illegal. And in Miami, a couple of people have been arrested for this. And there's also a website, localbitcoins.com, where you can trade bitcoins just between you and me, and not via exchange. And that's highly illegal. In Europe, it's legal, but if you do it here in the United States, you will get arrested. So please watch out for this.
Or like they can't actually know whether you're doing
Yep.
it. It's like illegal, but like how they find out.
Yeah, and as you can see, how the government did this. So they went with an undercover agent to exchange 30,000 for bitcoins, and then they arrested the guy. So it's quite stupid how the government is trying. How the government is trying to 29-year-old guy who wanted to make some money and thought it was legal. So yeah, you see how the government is trying to do this. How many time do we have? Do we have sound on this?
I can turn up the volume.
I don't know if
Yes.
I'll just take my laptop though.
Is it?
The truth about Bitcoin and alternative currencies. The US dollar has been the world's most popular currency for over half a century, but that's starting to change. Our central bank's been meddling with the value of the dollar, and people are looking to replace it with something better. One currency has been making news lately, Bitcoin, a new digital currency. Lots of things have been used as currency throughout history. Gold and silver, wheat, seashells, tobacco, salt, paper, and numerous other things. Some currencies have stuck around, lots have died off. But why? What makes some currencies better than others? It's not any government decree, it's their properties. Certain properties are essential to a healthy currency, and if we keep score, the US dollar doesn't look so great, especially in comparison to historical favorites like gold and silver, or to Bitcoin. A sound currency stays valuable over time, has a limited supply, and is easily divisible and portable. If we want to compare currencies head-to-head, we need to understand the importance of these qualities. Imagine that a currency doesn't stay valuable over time. For example, let's say we use bananas as a currency. Well, bananas have a lifespan. They eventually rot. A large store of savings in bananas would eventually turn to mush, and nobody wants to trade rotten fruit with each other. The US dollar doesn't rot, but thanks to the central bank, it's lost about 95% of its purchasing power in the last 100 years. Gold and silver don't rot either. They're durable and have a long history of being valuable. Bitcoin also doesn't degrade over time. The ones and zeros will be the exact same 50 years from now. It's a decentralized currency, not issued by any one institution, which means its value is independent of a government or central bank. As long as people find it valuable, it will stick around. Next, imagine a currency without a limited supply. Let's say we use wooden nickels as a currency. What happens when people start carving their own? If people can easily create more currency for themselves, economic prices become meaningless. Since the 1970s, the US dollar has had anything but a limited supply. The central bank has created trillions of dollars out of thin air, devaluing everybody else's dollars in the process. In contrast, the supply of gold and silver has been relatively constant for the last few millennia. Bitcoin also has a stable supply. In fact, at any given time, we know almost exactly how many exist and at what rate they will be produced in the future. No more than 21 million Bitcoins will ever be created. It's written.
So this is what you. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so this video actually didn't go into it as much as I wanted to, or I was thinking it would. But what I really wanted to point out was that, like, you can think of, like, the regulation of Bitcoin, how, like, the government has as much power to regulate it as it does, like, cash, pretty much. So, like, technically, there's, like, all these regulations that we've been talking about. Like, the government says, yes, we're regulating it, but it's extremely hard for them to enforce it. Because, like, they could say, like, oh, you're not allowed to send money from, like, this account to this account. And with, like, digital money, like typical, like, credit card, with, like, moving stuff between banks, they just have to go to the banks and say, like, oh, don't let these accounts exchange. money, but like you can't do that in Bitcoin. So all of these things are like all these regulations are extremely theoretical. The only place that they can really stop, like do any sort of enforcement, is like at the like endpoints of the Bitcoin network, like the point at where you actually like exchange Bitcoin for like something in the real world, or like exchanges where people are exchanging US dollars for Bitcoin, because a lot of like because the government does have the ability to like control US dollars and like regulate that and kind of enforce that. So that's really the only place where the government can enforce things.
Yep.
So like you can use it for money laundering just like cash.
So,
So yeah, next week's lecture is on anonymization. So this is like, so what I was just saying was like, they can't really enforce things. If you want to do like money laundering and you want to get money from like an exchange like Coinbase, they do collect your identity and everything. And because like all transactions are publicly available, you can see that like, you can like track things through like the blockchain and see like which money was like who ended up with the money, because they know where it started off going to. And so next week's lecture is all about like how we can like fight that and like actually maintain some level of anonymization. So like even if your identity when buying Bitcoin is known, you can still like make transactions without having the identity ever known.
Yeah, please try to do actually try to do the readings for next week, because we really want to talk about the cool, interesting ideas. And to do so, we need a framework by which we analyze anonymity. So the first 3 sections of 6.1 in the textbook cover how you typically de-anonymize, what an anonymity set means, like all the different properties of pseudo-anonymity, linking your identity to your addresses, etc. Optional reading is a accessible little introduction to zero-knowledge proofs. I think it's pretty cool. And then as for our announcements, we're hosting Zcash, which is the newest anonymous cryptocurrency. I argue that it's an order of magnitude more anonymous than anything else that currently exists. And they're going to be here in Berkeley next Monday at 7 p.m. in the D Lab, 356 Sparrows. So we'll be sending out a homework prompt tonight, or you can go to the meetup and mark your attendance with us and skip the homework. And then Tobias is going to...
yes. So last Monday we hosted our first info session for the Blockchain Association. I see a couple of familiar faces. And as many of you may know, we have applications that are due. And they're due to Friday for the developer application. If you want to get involved in the Blockchain Association, please take a look at the link and apply for a position if you want to. And also for business, if you're more interested in the business side, please apply. It was a very successful evening. 64 people showed up, and I think also maybe more people were on doing the midterm. So if you maybe were at the midterm, take a look at the Facebook page, because we have the slides up there, and you can scroll down if you want to know more, or just email me or Max or Sunny. So, and this is the timeline. So what I said before Friday, please turn them in, and then we have the first interviews between the 30th and the 31st. And the rest will follow. Okay, thank you.